And welcome, Hamish Lowe, virtually from Oxford. Great to have you here. And we're very much looking forward to your talk, which is right spot on the topic of the summer school. Very much looking forward to your talk.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you very much for asking me to give this talk. I am very sorry I'm not there in person. What I wanted to do was a couple of things, really. I really wanted to take two things. Really, I wanted to do a combination of going through a kind of fundamental, kind of core research question, which seems at the heart of what the summer school is about. And then alongside that, I wanted to talk about some kind of issues about research process. And I want to do that because those are the sort of things which we tend not to talk about. We tend just to give our papers. We don't talk about those kind of underlying issues about why we made particular decisions or particular assumptions in our work, why we reach particular modeling approaches and so on. So I wanted to kind of do a combination of talk about this kind of underlying research question, which is about how do we understand within period and intertemporal decisions on savings and labor supply, which is really at the heart of this question about how do people respond to shocks and so on. So alongside that fundamental question, so I'm going to intersperse it with some discussion about what I think of as being the sort of research process questions, which as PhD students you should be thinking of, and the ones which I think all researchers do think of as they're going along, and particularly in the field of kind of using kind of structural models. So in that sense, you can see there's three, in terms of research process underlying it, these three separate sort of questions. One is really about how do these sort of research ideas develop? And I think it's important because we often just come across finished papers or almost finished papers without understanding how people reach the point of actually writing the paper they wrote. Second thing is really about what I feel very strongly about it is we have this so often this disconnect between our kind of empirical approaches and the kind of underlying economics. And I feel to address questions is a really important part of understanding that kind of research process. And then the third thing, just some kind of practical considerations as we kind of go along. Okay, so that's my plan. I want to do this. Essentially, I'm going to be using a paper of mine, which is mainly based on this paper, which is like 2-3 years old now, with Orazio Attanasio, Peter Level, and Virginia Sanchez Marcos, looking at these labor supply questions. There's some bits and pieces of extensions of it as well. But then, as I said, the other paper I want to kind of use in thinking about this is, well, a reference I put up here is the kind of Journal of Economic Prospectus paper I wrote on how to use these structural models in econometrics. And it's really about this kind of combination of these using theory and using data at the same time. Okay, great. So that's the plan. It's a combination of those two things. Let me get sort of get going. My computer's not working particularly well. It's too early in the morning in the UK. Oh no, it is working. Great. Okay, so let me just be clear on what the kind of motivation for the substantial economic question is. So this is really about trying to understand how women's labor supply responds to changes in wages. So this is what we need, and this is at the heart of what you're doing in the summer schools, thinking about the design of that tax transfer system, what's the welfare cost of the taxes and benefits, how effective for tax cuts and stimulating work, which we've seen in a lot through the these different recessions, and also this kind of business cycle phenomenon about labor supply of the business cycle. And I guess that's where this is a topic which is very much a kind of mixture of micro and macro sort of fundamental questions. So what I want to focus on today, the particular things I want to focus on today are, one is that we need, when we're thinking about labor supply, is the need to integrate across different sorts of decisions. And what I mean by that is we don't just have labor supply decisions, we've also got decisions about how much to save. We may have other sorts of decisions about fertility, about when to retire, about how to spend our money on different sorts of goods. There's a whole range of sort of different decisions. I'm not going to look at them all today. I'm just going to focus on thinking about this kind of interaction between consumption decisions and labor supply decisions within the period and across time. But as a kind of general principle, when we're thinking about any sort of choice, we should be thinking about how does that fit in to the individual. Second thing I want to focus on is the degree of heterogeneity across individuals. And I think often when we think about heterogeneity, we think about this in a very sort of reduced form way, in the sense of it's just saying, well, people are different. We've got to think about what people are different. I mean, we introduce things like individual fixed effects to allow for sort of differences, but that doesn't really help us to understand what's going on. So we want to try to understand how much heterogeneity is there across individuals, and can we, in a sense, can we parameterize that heterogeneity to understand what's the kind of underlying differences in economic preferences or in economic decisions, which is generating that heterogeneity. And the third thing is just some of this interaction of the individual decisions with the aggregate, which follows naturally from thinking about the heterogeneity across individuals. So if I'm thinking about this responses, about how do individuals respond to wage changes or to tax changes, we've got to think about what's the dimension of response we're interested in. And that's where essentially this comes down to what elasticity is it that we're interested in. And we've got our different concepts of elasticity, which I want to spend a minute just being clear about. So we've got our within period responses. So the within period responses, we talk about kind of Marshallian and Hicksian, the ones we learned right at the start of doing basic economics, are the ones where essentially you're holding constant your intertemporal allocation. So you're thinking about, you change the wage, that change the wage in a particular period, you're not changing anything in any other period, you're just considering how do your decisions within that existing period change, holding constant the amount of savings and holding constant your decisions in other time periods. Now, that's a kind of concept which is in some sense fairly meaningless when you think about the decisions people are actually making. Because the decisions people actually are making are ones where if you give them a higher wage in a particular period, that may change the amount of savings they want to take into the next period. It may change how they adjust their lifetime behavior depending on what they think about persistence. But in particular, that kind of static concept, once we think about people in a life cycle environment, is kind of less relevant. But it's a very easy one to estimate, which is something I'll come back to. So one of the questions is, how well does it capture what it is we're actually more interested in? Second elasticity is this kind of Frisch elasticity, which we talk about a lot. But just to be clear what we mean by Frisch elasticity, this is your dynamic incentive to intertemporally substitute labor supply in this context. But it's essentially assuming it's under certainty. So it's not allowing for any, it's saying you're changing your behavior because of the way intertemporal prices are. And it's not saying you're changing your behavior because resources have changed. And I think that distinction between what's being driven by a price change and when does a price change also have a resource change is, I think, important. So here the Frisch elasticity is really thinking about what happens with a price change. It's not thinking about what happens when you change your resources, which then change your life cycle wealth or your life cycle possibilities, marginal utility of wealth. And then the third type of elasticity of what I call life cycle Hicksian or life cycle Marshallian, which are capturing the overall effect across how you work over your lifetime of a particular wage change. And so there is allowing for these changes in savings, allowing for changes in borrowing over time. The difference between the Frisch and the life cycle concepts here are the life cycle concepts are ones where we're allowing for the fact that a change in the price also may change your wages you have available. If you've got a permanent tax cut, it permanently changes your wages. And so it permanently changes your resources you have over your lifetime. So not only do you have that price change, which means you may want to change the timing of when you work, it also changes your total resources you actually have available. Okay. And then the other aspect of this is just which margin we're talking about, hours of work, the kind of intensive margin, the number of weeks worked, which is kind of the extensive margin, all this of time and consumption. I want to think about those different things. And then the other two other kind of important sides to this are really when we're trying to think about these concepts, we're going to think about what are the sort of shocks people are facing, and then similarly, or related to that, how important are those life cycle motives? Now, this last question is really coming back to thinking, well, can we use what people do in a static model, or using static environments, to capture or to approximate what's happening in a more dynamic life cycle context? So let me just spend a couple of minutes thinking about positioning how these sort of questions fit into the broader sort of literature, some of which you're being, other people are talking about this week. So Mike Keane has talked about the returns to experience more through his work. But let me just go through a little bit about this literature, because I think that really helps give some of the context of where this literature is going. So there's a kind of old literature back to the sort of early 80s, which was focused very much on these, what I call dynamic labor supply methods, where they're looking at essentially Euler equation type approach for labor supply, thinking about how hours of work are going to evolve over time, and the different methods for dealing with those labor supply questions. This is using micro data sets and essentially controlling for individual fixed effects in different sorts of ways. The striking thing is that if I look at the kind of estimates that came out of that literature, the kind of Hicksian response which was coming out, which is around about 0.3. This is kind of a static Hicksian estimate of around about 0.3. But the striking thing I find reading this literature is the large variation across studies. Even if you read these studies, which are essentially using fairly similar methods, there's large variation across studies. And in terms of the estimates of the fish, they're larger than the Hicks, which is what we kind of expect. But there is this kind of underlying question, but why do we get these differences across different sorts of studies? And then for men, the evidence is that actually it's very small responses. Now that's a kind of our standard picture from the micro literature about what happens to labor supply. Women's labor supply is more responsive than men's, but there's a lot of variation in the estimates across different ways of estimating and different data sets and so on. And I think that the other thing that's kind of raises straight away is exactly what are the parameters we actually are interested in, and what are the ones which are we picking up. So the key assumptions which do generate some of this variation across these micro studies are really, well, the first one is about how is consumption controlled for? How's the marginal utility of wealth controlled for? And what that's getting at is saying we want to control for marginal utility of wealth because that's the resource change. We want to control for what happens to your resources over your lifetime. And we do that by controlling for your marginal utility of wealth. But that can be done in different ways. It can be done through controlling for, by putting consumption in there in the regression. It can be done through looking at some sort of fixed effects, and it can be done through just differencing out taking the difference of labor supply. The other assumptions, one other assumption then is important, is about how much non-separability there is between consumption and leisure. There's particular assumptions you can make about that which would generate differences in your estimates. There's how we think about uncertainty. What's the participation margin? Is that more important than the intensive one? The estimates which I've got at the top of the slide are based on the intensive margin. So because it's always focusing on elasticity, it's always looking at essentially an hours margin. And I think that one of the issues here is that's not necessarily the right margin to think about in terms of understanding how people respond, the results of that kind of participation margin. And then the final thing is the assumptions about human capital, in that in these papers here at the top, they're not assuming, they're ignoring the role of human capital. There has been this literally the last 20 years looking at, well, how important is human capital, both for understanding how people's wages evolve, but also for understanding how does people's labor supply change, the timing of their labor supply change over their lifetime, which is what Mike Keane's been working on a lot. The issue is if I compare that to the kind of more macro literature. So the more macro literature gets a very different sort of picture here. the more macro literature gets much larger estimates of responses of labor supply to wage changes. So in particular, there's these kind of frisch elasticities, which are coming in at being over 1 in a lot of the macro literature. And elasticity of over 1 means that, 1% increase, the wage is 1% higher today than it is next year. It means that labor supply will be more than 1% higher. And so that's a kind of pretty high, that's a pretty stark intertemporal substitution that's going on with those kind of estimates for those frisch elasticities. But I guess what's really important here is that there is this big difference in what we see estimated by looking at the macro aggregate numbers than we get from looking at the micro numbers. And there is more of an extensive margin focus in the macro literature. But I think one of the points I want to kind of stress here, because this kind of leads into what the way I try to think about this, which is there's a weak link between the individual preference parameters and aggregate labor supply. And I think one of the problems we've got in thinking about about labor supply is we're talking sometimes about how do we think about one person's responses, and other times we're talking about how do we think about the whole population's responding or particular groups. But we're also thinking about, we've got individual preference parameters which may guide how one particular person responds, but that's maybe very different from things like aggregate labor supply, which would depend a bit on what the distribution of types looks like and so on. Now, that issue of the individual versus the aggregate is ones which we're going to talk about a bit later on. Okay, so if I think just about this kind of research process, and I think about how do we to develop research ideas and thinking about these sets of questions. So these are not new questions. Understanding how people respond to tax change, understanding how they respond to wages is not a new question. But I think there are really 3 issues which this kind of raised when we started talking about this, working in this project, which was one, just this complete disconnect between different bits of the literature. There's different bits of the literature which have got these very different approaches, and there's no attempt to kind of reconcile why those different numbers are being, why they're coming up with different sorts of numbers. And so that's where you got this kind of disconnect between different bits of the literature, which are reaching very different numbers. And so there's a surprising lack of consensus. And yet no one's kind of understanding why is that lack of consensus coming about. And I think that makes it sound like we're trying to do some meta-analysis here. And that wasn't it really. It was more just trying to explore what's the kind of underlying economics which is generating the sort of heterogeneity we see in the estimates we see. So what's the kind of underlying model which is going to give us this sort of variety of estimates? And some of the thoughts on that kind of underlying economic models, which were kind of came out over time to try and talk through and think through what was kind of going on, is that this issue is that there was no unique elasticity. It's kind of one that's been kind of going around now for a while, but it was, what's the source of that heterogeneity and elasticity? Is that substantial heterogeneity, or what's kind of driving that heterogeneity and elasticity? So it's not just saying people are different. We've got to understand in what ways are they actually different. The other issue about the underlying economics was this issue of there were different responses in recessions and booms. So in particular, we've got estimates of labor supply elasticities taking place at different points in the business cycle. And you can see that when you do these estimates in booms, you tend to get smaller estimates of responses than if you do them in recessions. So there is this question about, are the differences happening according to the aggregate situation of the economy, according to where people are? And then the other kind of related questions, how should we combine responses across different margins? We've got these different sort of choices people are making at the same time. So we should think about what margins actually matter. And that's kind of related to this question of what decisions are being ignored when we're making this analysis. So if we're just focusing on a labor supply question, then what are we saying about fertility? What are we saying about the joint labor supply decision? What are we saying about savings? And if I want to just give a little plug for Thomas Jorgensen's paper tomorrow. So his paper with me and Katrine Jacobson is looking at what happens about when we've ignored fertility in these questions, what difference does that make? So that's kind of building on, in some ways, it's building on the sort of stuff I'm talking about today, where we're saying, look, actually, there are these different decisions people are making, and we've got to think about which decisions matter. And it's clear we're not going to be able to model everything. We can't model everything, so we've got to think about which bits of the decision, which other decisions actually impact on the labor supply decision. So, for instance, in that case, it's like, well, thinking about fertility, does decisions about how many children to have, does that change, does the allowing for that decision at the same time as the labor supply decision actually change the labor supply results? Now, that's a separate question from saying we can take fertility as being a process, as exogenous to what people are doing. And then given their fertility situation or their children's situation, they're going to behave in a particular way. So we can take fertility and demographics as being given and recognize they'll change behavior, but think that that's the kind of first decision that's made, and then the labor supply decision is the second decision that's made. Or we can think that's being joint decisions. But we have to have some thinking about what are those decisions that are being ignored. And then the final thing is really what unit is making decisions. I think that Christina Donati is going to talk about this later in the week, is, are we talking about the individual? Is it the household? And crucially, how stable is that household? Are households actually, and what happens when you get households forming or dissolving over time? Does that change how people's labor supply changes? So we had all these kind of different thoughts about what the underlying economic questions were. Of course, the reality is you then confront these different thoughts with what you can actually achieve. And we end up thinking about essentially those first 3-4 questions. And we didn't think so much more about thinking about fertility, and that came into this kind of more subsequent project. Okay. So let me just talk about the structure, what I want to do for the rest of this talk. What my plan is to talk for about 40 minutes or so, take a 5-minute break, and then talk for another kind of 40 minutes, something like that. So what I want to do is just go through kind of simple model. I'll be pretty quick on this because this is pretty standard. I'm going to talk a little bit about the empirical strategy and the data, and then the estimates, some elasticities. And as I said, as I'm going through this, just to talk about how, what the issues are which are kind of being faced. So think about the model. If I just take a kind of simple, this is a kind of very simple view of the, it's a very simple model in the sense it's a unitary life cycle model. It's married couples. Straight away, you should think, crikey, that's going to have a huge amount of selection to who's actually being looked at. I think that kind of issue about data selection is actually much more important than we usually allow for. Anyway, so we've got a making are about how much a woman are working, both intensive and extensive margin. They've got saving and consumption. But things we're not allowing for here, we're not considering men's choices about labor supply at all, take that to be given. And we're not considering within consumption where money is actually being spent. So we're just taking consumption as being an aggregate here. And just thinking about there's 2 things you spend. You've got your consumption and you've also got your leisure. We've got preferences that are, again, utilities time separable, exponential discounting. And I think that when, and then we've got a very flexible kind of preference specification. And then the third thing here is just about resources and markets. And the resources and markets, you can think, well, we've got uncertainty over wages, women's wages, and uncertainty over men's earnings. We're taking fertility to be exogenous. So it's just different types of people according to what their fertility process is. And in terms of the markets, it's kind of incomplete markets, partial equilibrium framework. But I think it's worth just stressing that this kind of split between these different building blocks we need. And I think the key building blocks we need in any of these life cycle models are helpful. I find it helpful to split them into thinking about what are the choices people are going to be making as a kind of starting point. But then there's these 3 components. One's your preferences. One's the resources you have available across your lifetime. And the third one is the markets you have available either to transfer resources over time or the market you have available to insure yourself against different shocks. But that kind of split in terms of thinking about the building blocks in terms of preferences, in terms of resources and markets is what I'm always thinking. That's what generates our kind of models. And all models are then, it then makes it easy to see that, for instance, in preferences, we were kind of fairly flexible within the within period preferences, this kind of generalized constant elasticity of substitution framework, but we're assuming that utility is time separable, and with exponential discounting, which is a much more standard thing to do. Okay, so that's a kind of overview. I'm just going to give a couple of details on this just to be clear, because this is where we start to see how heterogeneity may impact on people. You can see, as I said, this is the expected lifetime utility. We've got choice about consumption, about leisure, and about PEPs, whether you're working or not. That's the extensive margin. And then your utility here for all periods is you've got consumption, leisure, participation. You can see we're separating out here the intensive and the extensive margin explicitly in the utility function. And that's to allow for there being differences about actually working at all, and then differences in extra hours. The conditioning here, these red variables here, well, ZH are just the demographics which are specific to that household. So H here indicates the household. So there's the demographics that are specific to the household, which may affect your utility. And then there's also these kind of preference shifters. And these preference shifters are going to operate in different ways. I can show you in a minute. But what preference shifters are doing is they're allowing there to be some forms of heterogeneity, but it's coming in a very particular sort of way, in the way in which utility is being looked at. I think I'm on the next slide, is you can see it up here. So you can see here we've got our, I'll come back to the budget constraint in a second. See, this is just a specification for preferences. And the reason I put this up here in this detail, essentially you can see we've got this kind of aggregator. M is this kind of CES aggregator between consumption and leisure. And you can see then we're kind of wrapping around that with a kind of CRRA specification with your 1 minus, raising to the power of 1 minus gamma. And then we're multiplying it here by this term, which is in the kind of preference, is the participation margin, and also your demographics and some of your heterogeneity. Now this looks like it's arbitrary, but in a sense, it's not. What this is really getting at is, and what I put in blue are the bits which really show what the kind of underlying, which driving the underlying economics. So the blue parameters, the ones which have then enabled us to say, well, this is what the underlying parameters are about. So let me just give an example of that. So M is essentially what's being capturing the within period decision making between consumption and leisure. And you can see here, we've got phi and we've got theta. And those two parameters are governing what is the curvature of consumption, and this is the curvature of leisure. So how willing are people to smooth, or how much do people need to smooth consumption, and how much people are willing to smooth leisure? And what we're going to see is that the curvature on leisure ends up being much steeper. Leisure is much more curved than consumption. So consumption is more willingness to substitute consumption than there is to substitute leisure. But once we've got this parameter estimates, we can then see it in this utility function. And I think this is one of the important things we want to kind of stress, is we've got to be able to relate our preferences and what we're estimating back to kind of underlying choices. Okay, and you can see here that the gamma is just our kind of intertemporal preference parameter. Z here is just how participation has an impact on our willingness to work separate from incentive margin and so on. Okay, that's the preference parameters. What I missed was just the budget constraint, but that's pretty standard, just saying there's some fixed cost of work, then you've got some and consumption. Okay. The other advantage of this specification is we can then nest these different forms of preferences. So we can think about a standard CES would have that the phi here was equal to theta. If it was Cobb-Douglas, we'd have phi and theta both equal to 1. And if we had an additive separability between consumption and leisure, we'd have gamma equal to 0. So we've got these different ways of nesting different sort of preference specifications. And one of the reasons for that was it then meant we could then see how does what we're estimating compare to what is done elsewhere in the literature. Okay. This is about wages and earnings. So that was a bit about preferences. Now we think about the resources. So resources people have are coming from from the women's wages and from the men's earnings. So from women's wages, you can just see there is some human capital here, which I'm going to call E. E is a human capital, which in this basic specification, it evolves independently of people's decisions about where they're working. And what I want to do later is show you what happens if we assume this, where there's a determinate, there's your wages following an exogenous process. And then what happens if we allow for your wages to depend on whether or not you've been working in the past, and see how that impacts on our elasticities. In terms of the kind of modeling and thinking about this kind of research process, we started out thinking this was going to be really important to have human capital in here. And in the end, it kind of matters a bit about how you model human capital, whether it matters. And we don't really know how important human capital is for a lot of individuals. And that's, I think, a kind of slightly dispiriting sort of conclusion to draw. So I'm trying to be a bit more precise about that. We know that if we don't have human capital in the model in the way that we're going to show you now, there's a lot of things we can estimate very kind of clearly. When we then put human capital in, it becomes harder to estimate what's happening. Some estimates change, others don't change. I'm going to show you that. In fact, let me come back to that issue later and try and be a bit more precise. Okay, men always work. Men's earnings are given just in this kind of, again, stochastic way. There are these stochastics, these permanent shocks, these are the new F and the new M. Okay, an initial distribution, which is not particularly important. But then again, in terms of the shocks people are facing, we've got these kind of permanent shocks to earnings and to wages, which are going to be correlated to some extent between men and women. Okay. As I said, I'm going to return to experience in later, just to kind of put into context of how we can think about return to experience. And I'm saying that because there's two ways we can think about returns to experience. So one is that people get extra wages because they have worked at all. So they get extra wages because they've participated. And the other is they get extra wages in the future, depending on how many hours they've worked in the past. And I think those two different formations have very different implications for what actually our estimation strategy, and also for our results. And what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you the results where returns to experience are based on participation in the past. So your wage today is higher if you worked in the past, but it doesn't depend on how many hours you worked in the past. And that's going to allow us to do a lot of the estimation we're ready to do, and also generates these results, which makes us think that return to experience are not as important in some dimensions as as they might be. Okay. So as I said, we've got these three different types of responses to wage change. As I said at the beginning, we've got these kind of within period responses, which are about some Marshallian, Hicksian responses. That's about the within period allocation between hours and consumption, thinking about savings being unchanged. There's the kind of anticipated allocation of hours of work across time. That's in response to E to F. E to F, if I go back just the wage equation here, E to F here is just how the wages are going to evolve over time. So you've got this evolution of wages over time, which is about how the price changes over time. But because it's anticipated, it doesn't tell us anything about, doesn't change your actual resources you have available. That's why you get the anticipated allocation over time. And then the third aspect of this is where you've got your wage change leads to changes in your life cycle choices in terms of savings and perhaps also your participation choices. The reason I've split it into these three ways will hopefully be three steps, is hopefully going to become clearer, because at the heart of it, to estimate, to answer the estimates for each of these different steps requires different sets of assumptions. And you need increasing amounts of assumptions as you go through the three steps. So to make the estimation of step one, you don't need to make very many assumptions. Step two, you need to make additional assumptions. Step three, when you're estimating the whole model, you need to make a lot more assumptions. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about why that's such a, why we've taken that sort of approach of trying to break this down, these three different steps. And that's really comes down to this what's the kind of research process? So there's two different approaches you can take here. So one is this, what I think about as a kind of the minimal assumptions on the structure to generate the estimates. So I kind of think we should be when we're talking about estimating, getting particular estimates, we should be thinking what's the minimal assumptions on the structure to generate these estimates. It's not saying we're not going to make assumptions, we always make assumptions. It's just thinking about what's the minimal set of assumptions we need. Now, why is that? Well, those three sorts of response on the previous slide, they require increasing sets of assumptions. Let me just give you an example of that. So if we go back to the slide here, to understand how wage changes lead to change in life cycle choices, we're going to have to specify all the resources available over the lifetime. We have to specify the retirement decision. We're going to have to specify what do we think about bequests. We're going to have to think about what's the whole path about life cycle wages. So you can see here, and you have to make assumptions about demographics and about whether households remain intact. There are a whole range of different assumptions which have to come in to that third step in order to get those complete estimates. If we just look at the first step, when we're looking at within period hours of work and consumption decisions, we're holding savings unchanged. Now, it may be, there's a question about what is that something we're interested in or not, but given we're interested in that, what assumptions do we need in order to get to those within period estimates? Well, actually, they're much less, because I'm just looking at the within period trade-off, holding everything else constant. I'm not having to specify or model explicitly exactly how the retirement decision works. Now, the value of that is that what it means is that if we're specifying how the pension system works and we get it wrong, and we're estimating everything together, then that misspecification will affect our estimates in, say, the first stage. So what we want to do is we want to be using the assumptions we need to make to do the estimation, which means that we don't get the same contamination from misspecification in the rest of the process. So the contrast to that, let me just contrast that, is where we estimate everything in one step. And I think that the advantage of estimating all the parameters in one step is that it's clear that the estimates are going to be consistent with each other. They're consistent with each other in the sense of all the within period estimates, they're all going to be done within the same model structure. And so they're all going to be consistent. There's two issues with this. One is it's computationally burdensome because you've got many more parameters. You would like to have many more parameters to have to estimate by doing it in that way. The third thing is that the misspecification of any bit impacts all estimates. And I think that's kind of it's a very loose notion of robustness here. Have we got robust estimates? How robust are our estimates to misspecification? If we're doing things in this structural way, we're going to end up having misspecification of any one bit will have this impact elsewhere. And hopefully that'll become a bit clearer as I sort of go through the kind of empirical strategy for this. Okay. And I think one of the things, if we are going to go down the route here of using minimal assumptions and structure to generate estimates in those kind of three steps we're talking about, it's actually also really important we then go back at the end and then we check that we've actually got consistency between the estimates across the three steps. And so here, that's where this kind of alternative approach of estimating everything in one step, where you get the estimates which are consistent with each other, well, that in itself that's automatically done in that process. If we're going to do it in this kind of sequential step of building up with ever increasing amounts of assumptions, then it's more important at the end to go back and check that things are correctly specified, are consistent. But I guess that even when we say we're estimating all the parameters in one step, I kind of think this is an important principle, is to think that we never believe we're modeling the whole world. And I'm saying that just in the sense that we're never going to be, we have to shut some things out. We shut some things out of the model. And so we're always got a danger of misspecification. We're always got a danger of leaving some things out. And so we're never going to be completely consistent with all the choices people are making. So the question really comes down to which decisions are important or which bits are important to include in the model for the question which actually is being addressed. Okay, so let me spend 2 more minutes on this, and I'm going to take a break. So I think hopefully this will be kind of clear in this sense. So this is the within period allocation. So essentially, this is getting that first set. This is getting at the static life cycle, the static Marshallian and Higgsfian elasticities. I've got the derivation of the slides. I'm not going to go through the whole derivation, but I just put it there so you could see what was kind of going on. But you can see what's happening here is you define your within period income. You define your within period income. This is kind of unearned income, which is your residual income once you've got your income from the man's income, once you've made the fixed cost of participation, and you've holding the change in savings. So it gives you within period budget constraint. Now that within period budget constraint, you can then think about the optimization that happens. Individuals would be optimizing their utility given that within period budget constraint. I notice that's then a very straightforward optimization problem that comes down to just generating this MRS condition. There's nothing here about expectations now. There's nothing here about your future decisions. There's nothing about your having to specify how your assets are going to evolve. There's going to specify how much you discount the future. All that comes into this optimization is you've got a within period budget constraint, and you're going to maximize your utility, which is then going to generate this MRS condition where your wage is just equal to the ratio of marginal utilities. You can see now we've got an expression here which is relating a wage to leisure and to consumption. And that's going to help us to enable us to pin down these parameters which govern the curvature of leisure and consumption within the period. But those parameters are actually important parameters in terms of our underlying economic model. But here, to estimate this MRS condition, there's a limit to how many assumptions we need to make. All we need to be able to do is to write down the within period budget constraint. Now, of course, there are assumptions underlying that which are about your resources being held constant, but we can actually estimate these parameters under that condition. Okay, and then we've got the responses given that, which I'm not going to kind of go through. Okay. So the intertemporal allocation of resources held constant, that's what's going on there. Your static elasticities, they depend just upon phi and theta. They don't depend upon gamma, that intertemporal elasticity. We have these expressions for elasticities, which are nonlinear. I skipped over that. Just to show you here, you can see these are the elasticity measures. You can see they're nonlinear in leisure and consumption because they're both entering in the numerator and the denominator in this very nonlinear way. Okay. So the fact that you've got these nonlinear elasticities means that you're going to have these impacts from aggregate shocks, even if there's they've got mean zero and you shuffle the wage distribution around, because someone's elasticity who's got very low levels of leisure is going to be different from someone who's got very high levels of leisure. So the elasticities are not constant, and there's lack of constant elasticities means that aggregate shocks will have implications for the overall response. Okay. Yeah, and then I'm going to skip over that for now. So, and then if we think about the intertemporal choices, the intertemporal choice is basically using that second stage. Essentially what we're then doing is then going to be holding our marginal utility or wealth constant. And that's the kind of approach that Mike has been using and following from Tom McCurdy's work in the early 80s. So you end up with these kind of expressions for holding marginal utility or wealth constant. Essentially, they're just dynamic equations for how does, this is the change in the log of consumption, of leisure, how does leisure evolve over time as you change the wage rate over time. And you're doing that in the intensive margin. And of course, again, what you're doing is you're able to hold constant, you're not having to make assumptions about what's driving this marginal utility of wealth. And that marginal utility of wealth will be affected by what resources are going to be in the future, in retirement and so on. But if you're estimating an Euler equation, you're not having to specify all those future outcomes. You're not having to specify exactly what drives that marginal utility of wealth because you're just treating it as a fixed effect. So if you think about that first approach, the first step, we were taking resources across your lifetime. You're just talking about resources you have within the period and looking at within period allocation. And now we move to thinking in that second step about understanding the kind of Frisch elasticities. That's where we're thinking about the marginal utility being held constant. And then again, what we're not into is not to specify the full income process. We're not to specify the full life cycle model. And then the third step in this, not worry about that. And the third step of this is we want the full life cycle responses, where we're not able to do this just by direct estimation. We've got to do this, just the full numerical solution of the model to get the savings and life cycle profiles. But what that requires is a full specification about the income process. It requires understanding about exactly how preferences are how markets are operating over different points in your lifetime. And that's important, but we don't want that information, those assumptions to then contaminate the earlier steps. Okay, so in this kind of third step, the life cycle responses, we're going to have to kind of fully solve the model. You get the intensive margin, extensive margin, you get the savings, you get the accurate response, you get the whole thing with these life cycle responses. That's the benefit. And the cost is you're going to make a whole bunch of extra assumptions. Okay, and we can put in that role for returns to experience here if we also wanted to do that. Right, let me do this. Let me stop for like 4 or 5 minutes. And I thought I just put on this quote just on the screen while I was stopped, because it's wonderful. Which I think it's kind of captures what I think of as how we should approach structural modeling. And I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to put it on there, and let's carry on in. Okay. So anyway, this was just this modeling quote about a bit up, which is for people to have in mind, is just this kind of reminder that I think that particularly given the audience which you are, that the real danger that we always try to model too much. And I just think this is kind of a reminder of, we've got to think about what is it we're actually trying to model, what's the question we're after, and what bits do we need to have to go into the model in order to answer that. And the reason why I think that's so important is because it enables us to actually understand the mechanism, enables us to understand what's actually driving things within the model. And if the model becomes too much of a sort of black box of, I've just put everything in it and I'm getting this out, then it's very hard to understand what the actual underlying economics is. So I kind of firmly believe we need the structure, and I firmly believe we need the structure of a model in order to understand what the data is actually what the data is actually saying. But we need not to try to capture everything and just put things in because we think it exists out there in the world. Okay, let me carry on. So let me talk a little about the empirical strategy, and then I want to go to some of the estimates and so on. Let's see how we get on. So empirical strategy, I've started talking about a little bit in terms of thinking about it in these different stages, depending on what sort of assumptions we need in order to make different sorts of estimates out. So that's where, if I think about these kind of estimation steps, we can think about it coming about these three steps, where the first one is just using the within period condition, that MRS condition. And we're going to use that just to estimate those curvature parameters governing the within period CES, the theta and the phi. And so that enables us to compute those static elasticities and to think about aggregation of those static elasticities. That's a bit like the kind of, based on the kind of old work of McCurdy, which is then kind of fed through and become kind of very standard approach for doing the kind of static approach. Then we're going to use the Euler equation, the second step, the kind of intertemporal choice, to estimate the intertemporal parameters, the intertemporal elasticities parameters. And that's all basically on the intensive margin. That means we can then think about the degree of non-separability, think about the role of demographics, and so on. And then we're going to have a third step where we're going to use method simulated moments in the full structural model to estimate the remaining parameters. And in particular, that's going to enable us to get at these extensive marginal responses and also think about the kind of role of uncertainty. But the kind of principle of this is at each step, we're going to be able to, we want our estimates here to be as kind of robust as possible. And so we're going to use the kind of only the assumptions we need in order to make those estimates. So just a little bit more on that. So if I think about that MRS condition I wrote down, essentially, if I take the log of the MRS, we're just going to get an equation which is the log of the wage is just going to depend upon the log of consumption, the log of leisure, and on demographics. And then you've got some heterogeneity. The issues here, and this is where the kind of interaction between these different steps comes in. So the one big issue here is clearly selection. We're only going to observe the wages for people who are actually working. So, but in other words, the selection to work. So the chi-HT are not going to average out to 0 if we're just looking at people who are working. So that selection into work is essentially why you'd want to have a model here of participation. So this would be an argument for saying we want to be estimating this wage, this MRS condition, because this MRS condition is conditional on participation. We want to be estimating that MRS condition alongside estimating the participation equation. And what we can do or what we're doing in this approach is we're going to use a kind of reduced form correction for that selection. And then we're going to check at the end that our estimates of the model, when we've got the full model, and we go full model, which then describes the participation decision, whether it's consistent with that selection equation. But in doing the estimation here, we're going to deal with the selection problem in essentially a reduced form way by doing a kind of Heckman selection correction and control function approach. Okay. The other issue is, of course, endogeneity, which is that wages and consumption and leisure, they're all going to be correlated with the unobservables in the chi-HT, so we're going to have to do some kind of group averaging. But for the purposes of today, what I want to just kind of stress is we're going to estimate this MRS condition essentially on cross-section data, repeated cross-section data. And we're going to be controlling for the selection to work. We control for that dynamic participation equation by using the different exclusion restrictions like male earnings, male employment, and then come back at the end when we have the full model to check that that first step was actually consistent. But it enables us to estimate this in a much more straightforward way. One issue I want to just kind of mention in passing is that actually really matters what you put on the left and the right hand side here. So when you're doing these regressions, and actually one of the lessons I took from doing this work was that regression is not normalization free. And that normalization can make a big difference. And so some of the differences we saw in different estimates in the literature are coming about because rather than running the regression like this, with wages on the left-hand side, they run the regression with consumption on the left-hand side, or hours of work on the left-hand side. These things turn out to matter, so you want to do it in a normalization-free way. Okay, I'm just going to skip over that. The second step, this is kind of using the Euler equation. They've got the realizations. Again, we're going to take the log of that. Now, the step here is we're going from having here, which is the Euler equation and expectation, into the realized Euler equation. The realized Euler equation is where we've got, rather than our expectation, we've got this epsilon term here. And the epsilon term is just our error term. And the error term, which I don't worry about the maths, just the error term in terms of what it is it's containing multiple different bits. The error term here is going to contain our expectation errors. It's going to contain those kind of unobservable taste shifters. And it's also going to contain higher order moments because we've log linearized the Euler equation to write it in the way we wrote it. So when we think about the what we're doing in these regressions, we've got an error term there, which is going to contain these different components. We've got to find ways of averaging them out and getting them averaging out to 0, which is where we need some sort of time dimension in order to get the expectation errors averaging out. But the contrast between this and the first step, in the first step, there were no expectation errors. So we could do it in the cross section. In this step, we are going to have expectation errors because we're using realizations of hours of work rather than the expectation of hours of work. So the use of realizations means we've got those expectation errors. And so we need that time dimension in order to average those expectation errors out to 0. The way we actually approach this is we're going to have, we've taken our estimates from the first step of phi, theta, and phi. That means we can construct M. M is this kind of composite term here we had in our from our CES. So we can construct that value for m, and then it becomes an equation which is linear in parameters. So then it becomes very, again, straightforward to estimate, given we have a long time series, and so we can expect the expectation errors to be averaging out. Okay. And then the third step, just on the remaining parameters, which I'm going to talk a bit more about in a minute, is essentially capturing the extensive margin and the full life cycle choice. That's where the parameters we're missing still are the parameters of the budget constraint, fixed costs of work, childcare costs. Those are the things which we're still missing. So the strategy here is we're going to be using as inputs the estimates from step 1 and step 2. We're going to numerically solve the whole dynamic problem. And we're going to match the life cycle moments that capture that extensive margin. And I want to talk about how we choose the sort of moments we're going to choose, or why we choose the particular moments we choose, and so on. And then once we've got that, those match the moments, once we've got the full parameter set, we can then simulate responses to different sorts of wage changes in a more comprehensive way. Okay, but again, those different steps are all requiring different levels of assumption.
That's a good point. One thing I've been wondering, how do you think about the trade-offs between sort of using the inputs directly, sort of as fixed parameters, and basically thinking about steps 1 and 2 to generate starting values to then re-estimate the full model, including them?
Yeah, so so you're basically saying, and I think just to kind of make sure I'm being clear on what you're saying, we can think about those estimates from step 1 and step 2, and we're taking them and feed them into step 3 as, if you like, being the truth. Now, we can put them to step 3 with standard errors and so on, but we're basically putting them to step 3 and we're not updating those parameter values. And you say, why aren't we updating those parameter values in step 3? So the reason why is something which I think is, I'll be very kind of loose about this, is in principle, what you said is exactly what we should be doing. The danger of what happens is, I think the models, when we're doing these estimation, the models can end up focusing on matching moments which are precisely estimated. And I'm getting parameters which are precisely, which can adjust to match those particular sort of moments. So we can update the parameters, but the updating of the parameters will then depend upon whether we specify correctly that third step. So even if I put them in and allow those parameters to be updated, it's going to depend a bit on what moments we're using as to whether or not they're updated in a way which is going to help us with the economics. But even more than that, if we're updating them because we're using more information about the rest of the process. So I think the pension one's always the one that I think I was being the hardest one, because I always think it's very difficult to know what people expect about their pensions. If I'm trying to understand someone who's age 30, how are they trading off consumption and leisure, or consumption hours of work when they're age 30? If I take step 1 and step 2, put them into step 3 as starting values, then the final estimates we're going to end up with will depend upon me correctly specifying how that 30-year-old is thinking about their pension when they're age 30. So that's the I think the heart of the danger. It's what I think what we should have done, and I think it's an interesting thing to do, which is simple. I don't know what we actually did, is we could have done that and said, how were those parameters actually changing? Did they change because of the way we'd specified step 3? What we actually did was we took the model simulated labor supply responses in step 3, and then we treated that as the data, and then we re-estimated the underlying parameters. And so we could then see, is the kind of participation model we've got, is the model of labor supply we've got able to generate with our empirical strategy the estimates we fed in, which, given it's gone through the 3-step process, is kind of not completely straightforward. But I think it comes back to thinking we want those estimates from the first 2 stages to be robust to the specification in the 3rd stage. And if we just use a starting value, then you've got that iteration which can happen, which change the parameter estimates. And we don't know whether that's true variation or true parameter estimation, or whether it's something which is because of the precise way in which we specified the rest of the dynamic problem faced by the individual. So I think that it's still that kind of principle of trying to minimize the amount of information to get the robust results. Okay. The data was using some US data from CEX. I'm not worried about that too much. I'm not worried about descriptive statistics too much. We're going to run out of time. So let me just talk about the kind of estimates, just to give some flavor of where the kind of aggregation is coming through and what this means. So here you can see when we're estimating from the MRS condition, this is estimating in a normalization-free way. So we're going to estimate these parameters. So theta here is the parameter on, I've just complete, I've got this. Yes, theta is the one on leisure, sorry. So here, theta is the one on leisure of 1.75, phi is on a smaller 5.76. The smaller value means it's closer to being linear. So we've got these estimates from the MRS condition, which tell us that the curvature on consumption is more linear than it is on the curvature on leisure. So that means that hours of leisure are more likely to be similar over time, whereas with consumption, there's more willingness to have these being differing over time. But these are the estimates we get. As I said, we think it's the value of that is that they're kind of robust to the other assumptions, but they don't give us a whole picture about how do people actually respond. And I think that's the importance of getting to the end of step 3 is that you actually really want to know, you want to be able to simulate how people are going to respond. And to simulate how people actually respond, you have to actually know and specify the full budget constraint they face over their lifetime. So in that sense, this gives us information, but it doesn't give us the complete information. About how people are going to respond, you can see, I'm just going to skip over that normalization. That's just to kind of show it matters whether you're doing it what's on the left-hand side versus the right-hand side. And then the Euler equation, you can see we get an estimate here for gamma of basically 2. You can, the one point about this is that's not the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, because the value for gamma is going to vary. The value for gamma is the wrap around that CES expression. So the value for gamma doesn't on its own tell us anything about the coefficient of relative risk aversion or the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. We've got to think about that in a more broader way. Okay. So, and then step 3 in terms of the estimation of the full model. So that was step 2, and then third, but we use a particular cohort of women born in the 50s, age 25 to 55, external set of parameters and estimated parameters and moments. The issue and reason I want to stress here is that when we're starting to estimate a full model, we have to then be really specific about what group of people we're actually talking about. So here we're talking about one particular cohort, one particular age group, and we're following them over time. But we've really got to be kind of very careful about when we're talking about the estimation of the full model, we're kind of imposing some degree of stationarity. So that means it's got to really mean estimation of the full model is estimation for one particular cohort who are facing one particular set of circumstances over their life. And the way in which those circumstances are treated as being deterministic or stochastic really drives a lot of what we think of as being the final estimate, or what the final estimates turn out to be. So again, that's the kind of thing where the step 1 and step 2 don't suffer from the same need to specify that sort of. Perfect. So just about the moments, you can see what we've got here is a bunch of different moments. And the question, I think, one of the most common questions that I get from students is, how do you choose what moments you're going to want to target? And you can see here, just to see what we've got moments here which are capturing the kind of life cycle labor supply behavior. Moments which are capturing things about the wages and how wages are changing over time, and then a little bit of, and then at the end we've got something on wealth and income. How have we chosen those? So if you can just skip forward onto these kind of research issues onto the next slide. Thanks. So the question about what moments to use, again, it comes down to what we were trying to capture with this model was about the labor supply choices over time. Over the life cycle. So for us, having both the wages and the labor supply correct the wages over time, over age correct, and also having the labor supply or the participation over time correct was really important. Now here, if we were also estimating those kind of preference parameters, which were governing the elasticities, we'd also want to be having it within our moments which were capturing how labor supply changed with respect to wages. So you can imagine a moment which was the regression equation or the regression coefficient from the MRS equation. That could have been a moment we could have used. But we've put that directly into the structural parameter. But the point I want to make is that there's different things we wanted to get at here. We wanted to get at the elasticity of how people were responding to different changes in wages, but we also wanted to capture the profile of the life cycle of their wages. And so the elasticities were being captured by the first two steps, and then this third step, we're choosing moments to capture the overall life cycle profile. And I think that's partly, and we could have chosen different sort of moments, but it was really about choosing the moments to focus in on what question and what bits of behavior you really want to capture. And really the moments are what's the behavior you think is really important that you should be capturing to answer what it is you're asking about. What you then get to when you're thinking about using these different moments in this kind of method simulated moments is you've got to combine the moments to generate some criterion that we are trying to minimize. And essentially that comes down to the weighting matrix. So what's the weighting we're going to put on the different moments we've got in place? And I thought it was just kind of stressing here the 4 different options which I think people have, and people make different assumptions depending on what they're trying to get at. So one is a kind of equal weighting. So there's different moments. Each moment's got the same weighting in that final criterion. There's proportional deviation, which is where you're just normalizing a moment so that if you are 10% away from that moment in terms of your simulated moment, then that's going to be it's that 10% number rather than the absolute amount of the deviation. And then there's these 2 alternatives, which are we start to look at how precisely the moments have been estimated. So an estimate which is more precisely, a moment which is more precisely estimated, you may want to put more weight on it because it's a more reliable moment. And this is where I think one of the kind of key trade-offs comes in, because if you choose moments which have got very different degrees of how precise they're estimated, then the question is, do you put different weight on those moments? So let me give you a kind of a concrete example. So if I think about, say, participation rates over the life cycle, they tend to be very precisely estimated because we've got enough data to know how much people are working when they're age 35, say, or how much people are working when they're age 45. We can know very precisely what those participation rates are. So those moments are very precisely estimated. If I contrast that with, say, wage growth moments or duration of unemployment moments, then those moments can be much less precisely estimated, but they may be much more important or maybe equally important. So if we're weighting by the precision with which a moment is estimated, there is that danger we end up overweighting particular moments which aren't necessarily the ones that are of more economic interest. So I think that what that kind of says is that we want to think about the role of economic theory in this. And I think between those last 2, in terms of weighting the moments, there's 2 different things, the diagonals of the full variance covariance. You want to use the full variance covariance matrix if there's a lot of covariance between the different moments. So for instance, if your moments are participation rates at each different age for 40 years, they can be highly covariant. So you wouldn't want to treat those as being independent observations, and that's where you'd want to have the fuller variance covariance matrix. The downside of going down these, as you go down this list of 4, the tricky thing is that the variance covariance matrix itself becomes increasingly imprecisely, is likely to become increasingly imprecisely estimated. So obviously equal weighting, there's an Atonji and Segal paper which says you want to use equal weighting in this sort of method simulated moments approach because the variances of moments are themselves very imprecisely estimated. And so equal weighting is a way of avoiding that sort of imprecision.
but in kind of a principle of the better your moments are estimated, the more you can use the full variance covariance matrix. Now, when I say the role of economic theory in these questions, it's really this thing about what's the behavior the model's trying to capture. So you want to avoid matching well something that's less relevant. And that can be, you want to avoid choosing moments which are not relevant or not so relevant to your economic question of interest. But similarly, you don't want to put a lot of weight on moments which, even though they may be very precisely estimated, are not actually of such economic interest. So that's the puzzle, that's the tricky thing about the moment selection. You want to be matching things which you know you've actually got reliable estimates of those moments, but you also want to be matching things which are economically relevant. And I think that that's where there's an element which is imprecise about how to go about this. But those are the kind of principles of it. And I think that in different papers of mine, I've done different things. I guess recently I would tend to use the full variance covariance matrix and be selecting moments in a way where I was including moments of similar importance as I was, rather than having some moments which I wasn't actually bothered about matching. There's moments which I'm not that bothered about matching, then I would not include them. And then you can include them subsequently as extra robustness. Okay. Can we skip on? Hans-Van, I realize I've got 5 minutes left. Can you move to the next slide? Oh, I've got to move to the next slide too, sorry. Yeah, so that's the parameters we're going to end up with. Let's just skip on. These are just the parameter estimates. And these are the next slide, the life cycle profiles, just to show you the sort of matching that's kind of going on here. Some of these are pretty flat. The hours of work are pretty flat across time. And then some of them we get more of a kind of life cycle profile. Okay. But again, I think in terms of knowing how well these parameters are estimated, there are these various techniques which I want to, again, I think Thomas Jorgensen is going to talk about them a little bit tomorrow in his lecture, where he talks about how do we know which moments are actually relevant and which moments are actually valuable. And there's these kind of sensitivity metrics. Okay, can we skip on 2 more slides? So one slide more. So one slide earlier. One slide before that one. Yeah, what does validation mean? So what I'm going to do, because I've only got about 5 minutes, 6 minutes left, I want to talk a bit about validation, and then just mention some of the core key main results.
Hamish, don't worry about the time exactly. We had such a long break here with the issues we had, so feel free to do a little longer.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Okay, so what does validation mean here? And the validation is where we've got a structural model. So we've got through all these 3 steps, and we've got our estimates of the complete, what we think of as a specification of the complete model. And then we often think about, well, what should we do to actually validate that we've got a model which is appropriate? And I just written down here what I think of as being these 3 alternative of increasing difficulty of validating a particular model. So the first one is, can you replicate observed behavior not used in estimation? So that could be, so for instance, in this paper, in the previous slide, we had just showed what happened to behavior of particular sort of mothers of children of particular sort of age. We hadn't used that directly in the estimation, but it's pretty closely related to the estimation. So I think about that first bit about replicate observed behavior not used in estimation. If it's kind of labor supply at different ages, that looks to me like it's fairly close to the sort of moments we're already matching. We should be able to do that sort of replication. So that's the first sort of replication. The second sort of replication would be, well, can our model replicate observed behavior in a different time period or a different setting? And I think, again, I always think that's slightly problematic in the sense that we know that different time periods change the economic environment quite substantially. And so what we need to know is if we're going to do that as a replication, we have to recognize how the time period, how the economic environment has changed, and feed that into the model to see whether the model can replicate the outcomes. But in a sense, this is the strength. That's also the strength of this sort of approach, because what we have is we have estimates of the underlying preferences, and so we should, if we're changing the markets that are available, or we're changing the resources that are available, we should be able to feed that into the model and see what kind of final what the outcome is. And so in that sense, I think it's an important test of what we have is, can we actually replicate behavior in different time periods, allowing, but not in a kind of a straightforward, or let's just run the model in different time period. It's seeing how the resources in the markets change in different time periods and see if we can still replicate the behavior. And then I think the third bit of validation here is, can we replicate the results of experimental or quasi-experimental research, where there's a much cleaner sort of identification of effects, but our model should be able to replicate those sorts of effects if we are actually claiming we've got a robust estimates. So I think what's the purpose of this sort of validation? I think this validation is actually a crucial part of building these models. In some ways, and you realize I'm not an econometrician here, you can see that this is it's some protection against overfitting. We can always fit a model better by adding more moments and more parameters. That's just the nature of it. But that's that's generating a sort of overfitting to the current set of circumstances that are available. And so looking at the sort of validation is a way of some sort of protection against that overfitting. Again, that's the kind of fairly loose way. What I want to do is I want to show you on the next slide. Can we skip the next slide, Antoine, just where this is to give an example of the kind of combination of.
Let's have one question.
Oh, sure.
I'm sure I can pronounce the name, Jie Wen. So if we would like to fit some moments which we're more interested in, but they're estimated very imprecisely, is it allowable to add extra weights to these moments? Or is the most we can do to choose different common weighting matrices, identity, covariance?
So I'd be slightly pragmatic about it. So the first thing I would do on this is if I had in that situation, I would use a proportional weighting matrix and to see what's coming out, because the proportional weighting matrix is not putting extra weight on what's been precisely estimated. It's just correcting for the fact that there may be different scales. So if I have some moments which are very precisely estimated, other ones imprecise, which I really care about, I would not use the information on the precision with which the moments were estimated. That would be my main approach. What I would always do is, once I've got a set of estimates, I would then see how those set of estimates are take the set of estimates, use those as starting values with the full variance covariance matrix as the weighting matrix, and see whether it makes any difference. And I think that's the kind of a natural way of testing whether or not the choice matters. Of course, they are both. Any weighting matrix is going to give you consistent estimates, but we know that in practice that's just not true. And it was not, of course, it's true that they're consistent. It's not true that you're going to get the same estimates necessarily in a finite sample. So we end up with this. But that's the approach I would take. I would use the proportional weighting and then do a check at the end once I've got those estimates out of what difference it would make if I was using the full variance covariance matrix. That makes sense. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Yeah. I hope also for the person from whom I passed it on.
Okay, great. Can you move to the next slide, please? And one more. Great. So this is just this is trying to think about how do we use experimental, quasi-experimental evidence in thinking about you combining moments, combining methods. So this is just a picture which I've stolen from Thomas's presentation tomorrow, where Again, what we're trying to do there is we're trying to think about how do tax changes impact on labor supply and fertility at the same time. So combining these two different margins of response. That's not what I want to talk about now. What I want to talk about, just showing this picture, is just to show you the trade-offs that are faced in using experimental evidence or quasi-experimental evidence and structural approaches. So here, what this graph is showing is it's got the marginal tax rate on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, it's got the initial income in terms of Danish crown. So that's equivalent, divided by 5 to get it into US dollars, roughly. And here, the kind of shaded gray area, the distribution is just the distribution of income across the population. And then there's different tax schedules. If you just look at the difference between the black step schedule and the red step schedule, the black step schedule is what it was in 2008. The red is what it was in 2010. Okay. And if I was doing, and there's two approaches to understanding the impact of that tax schedule change. So one approach is a kind of reduced form approach, the other is a more structural one. The reduced form approach would be, if you look at where I've got it's labeled C and T on the around about the 300 initial income points, there's two. The C is the band, which is the control group, and the T is the treatment group. And you can see the control group had a very small change in their tax rate, whereas the treatment group had a much larger change in the tax rate. So we're going to get our estimates of the impact of the tax change by looking at the difference between those two groups. Now, what that tells us is it tells us in a fairly clean way what the impact is going to be for that group of people in terms of their labor supply consequences and their fertility consequences. It doesn't tell us about the impact of the change from the black step function to the red step function across the whole distribution. So this is exactly the trade-off we face. If we want to understand the overall impact of the tax change, we have to be modeling the behavior across the whole distribution. And typically that would be where we're getting our moments from, that whole sample. But when we're doing the kind of quasi-experimental evidence, we're going to just be looking at one very small sample of a population. So the reason I'm saying that is because not saying one's necessarily better than the other. Again, it depends on exactly what question you want to get at, but it's here in terms of the validation. If I want to validate a structural model which is estimating the response to the whole tax schedule shift from the black step function to the red step function, if I want to measure the whole impact of that, and I want to validate it by using quasi-experimental methods, quasi-experimental evidence, I've got to be really careful that I'm only using a sample of data which is very similar to the one that's actually used in the quasi-experimental group. So here it's only using incomes around about the 300,000 Danish crown. So I guess what I want to take from that is just the different ways in which we're using information and the different ways in which samples are coming about. And it kind of really, I think for me, it says why we need to have both these approaches in understanding, for instance, labor supply changes, because if we focus just on the narrow quasi-experimental evidence, you can see why where that cutoff happens to be may make a big difference to what the estimates are going to be. And so that's where we want to, and that may be part explaining why we're getting such a range of different estimates across different papers, because we've got very different samples and very different sorts of exogenous variation. So I think when we use that exogenous variation, the kind of key lesson I want to kind of stress is we've got to be really careful that we know exactly what the sample is, which is generating that exogenous variation, and we mimic that sample in the structural estimation and the structural validation. Okay, let me take a few more minutes just on talking about some of the kind of estimates. Can you move on a slide, please, Vance?
I think you should slowly come to an end now.
This is just to show you some of the results of the estimates, and then I'm going to show one more slide and then I'll conclude. So this is to show what's the kind of variation, what's the heterogeneity that we're getting in the elasticities that we estimate. So going back now just to thinking about the labor supply elasticities. So here on the left-hand side, this is about using across the distributions. This is just ranking by the distribution of the Marshallian elasticities. And you can see here the bottom solid black line on that left-hand graph. And then it's the hours elasticity on the y-axis, and it's the percentile, the Marshallian on the x. So the black line is just showing you how the Marshallian elasticity differs between the lowest and the highest number. And then the dashed black line is the Hicksian, and the dotted gray line is the intensive Frisch. So the first point is just the sheer amount of heterogeneity there is in those elasticities. Now that heterogeneity is coming about from a couple of sources. One is some differences in demographics, but the main difference is coming about just because of differences in the amount people are working and the amount of consumption they have. And that's what drives these differences in those elasticities. But look on the right-hand graph, it shows you how those elasticities differ by weekly hours. So the people that are not working many hours at all are highly responsive. People working a lot of hours are much less responsive in all these different elasticity margins. So we're going to get this heterogeneity according to what sort of position people actually find themselves starting in. And you can see how that's going to then translate into differences in heterogeneity according to the business cycle and so on. Okay, I should skip on and just show you one more. So this was just to then put together all these different responses and to show you what's, to kind of draw some conclusions on what's happening. So here, I've got this Marshallian, this is kind of overall how responsive people to changes in wages, kind of summarizing across different aspects of this. So here we've got the Marshallian and the Hicksian elasticities, but here I'm distinguishing between two sorts of Marshallian and Hicksian. So one is the life cycle response, which is where you're allowing people's savings to change. That's the kind of full response using the full model and allowing the participation to change. And then the static one from just making those kind of first assumptions where you've got the kind of holding constantly with your intertemporal allocation. So if you look at this, and we've done the same for the Hicksian. If I look at the life cycle response, you can see here, first of all, in those intensive elasticities, that the static measures are underestimating the overall life cycle response. So our static MRS measures of Marshallian elasticities tend to be too low. And the reason for that is because what happens when you get a wage change is some of the resources from that wage change move into other periods. Your wages are higher today. You're going to take those resources and spend them in other periods. The static measures assume you spend them all in the current period. So that's why you don't get the same response. The other point this is just showing you is just how the extensive margin response. The extensive margin response, and also we can calculate an aggregate elasticity, which is about 0.9 by aggregating up the extensive and the intensive. But the other point about this, the Marshallian, is simply that you've got the which particular point you are on the distribution or how you do the calculation will actually affect a lot what sort of size elasticity you get. And similarly with the Hicksian, you can see you do get a lot of variation according to how we're doing the elasticities. The difference here with the Hicksian is the MRS is a much better approximation to the static estimate, is a much better approximation to the full life cycle response than elsewhere. Okay, let me stop on that. Let me, do you want to just conclude briefly and then I can, so two sets of conclusions. One was just saying that there is this, these different notions of what an elasticity is. We can think about this in a static or life cycle context. There is substantial heterogeneity in the response, and the heterogeneity is substantial heterogeneity, particularly among people working few hours at work. And then just in research issues, can I just finish on that? If I do one more slide, if I give me one more minute, just to say these are the four kind of points I want to conclude thinking about research issues. So one is only using necessary assumptions to estimate the parameters, which I think is kind of really important. The flip side of that is you've got to be aware of what assumptions have been made or implicitly made. But that's the first thing. Second thing is the value of economics and thinking about moments and how to combine moments. So what's important to answer the question at hand is the kind of key issue, which is back to the question which was asked. The third thing is that the sample actually matters. You could be aware of who is who the estimate is actually coming from. And then the final point, just to kind of conclude, because I think this is the kind of key one I take away from this, is you're not able to capture everything in a model. So we need to understand the mechanisms of the model to understand what the what's actually kind of going on. If we make the models too complicated, we can no longer understand those mechanisms. But the need to understand the mechanisms is what is then crucial to us understanding whether we've got a good characterization or of what the behavior is like. Okay, I should stop there. Sorry for overrunning and sorry for all the technical problems.
Yeah, thank you. So let's give Hamish a big hand.